March 6, 1945. Cologne, Germany. The late winter air was heavy with smoke and the stench of brick dust. The ruins of the once proud city trembled under the constant thunder of artillery. Through the broken avenues, the sound of engines echoed, a deep metallic growl that sent a vibration through the rubble. German observers, hidden in shattered upper floors, adjusted their optics and froze. Emerging from behind the ruins were not the familiar silhouettes of Shermans they had grown accustomed to hunting. No. These shapes were different, longer, broader, more menacing. The barrels of their guns stretched forward like lances, the muzzle brakes glinting in the afternoon haze. The first M26 Pershings had entered the battlefield. Bundesarchive. Fragment of Cologne Defense Notes, March 1945. For months, German crews had fought Shermans like predators stalking sheep. They had grown confident, even arrogant, knowing their Panthers and Tigers could tear through American armor at ranges the enemy could barely dream of matching. But now, something was wrong, terribly wrong. When the first 90mm shell roared from a Pershing's gun, it tore through the front plate of a Panther across the square with a single shot. The impact was so sudden, so final, that German soldiers whispered to one another in disbelief. How could a Sherman do that? But this was no Sherman. This was something entirely new, a steel predator they had never expected to meet so deep in the heart of the Reich. U.S. Army After Action Report, Cologne, March 1945. Dust swirled around the cathedral square as Pershing engines snarled, advancing with the slow inevitability of a machine that did not need speed to inspire terror. A Tiger I, lurking near a pile of rubble, swung its 88mm gun toward the laid Pershing. For a heartbeat, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath. The German crew fired, the recoil echoing against the hollow bones of Cologne's ruins. Sparks erupted from the Pershing's front plate, but the round failed to penetrate. Inside the Tiger, silence spread like a plague. Unmöglich, one crewman muttered. Impossible. Their legendary 88 had failed to kill in a single strike. Panzer Crew Diary, dramatized composite. Then came the retaliation. The Pershing's gun boomed again, spitting fire and smoke. The 90mm round found its mark, shattering the Tiger's armor as if it were brittle glass. The explosion ripped the beast apart, flames licking skyward from the engine deck. German infantry, who had watched countless Shermans burn, could not comprehend what they were seeing. Tanks that should have died with one shot were surviving. Tanks that should never have threatened a Tiger were destroying them instead. In that moment, certainty collapsed, replaced by a creeping dread. The Pershing crews advanced with radios crackling, coordinating like a pack of wolves circling their prey. German defenders, accustomed to exploiting the chaos of slow Allied communications, found their ambushes unraveling. Tanks maneuvered with uncanny coordination, pivoting through rubble-strewn streets, suppressing resistance before it could even fully reveal itself. It felt like the battlefield itself had tilted in favor of the Americans. Signal Corps Report, Cologne Sector, 1945. Through the haze, civilians huddled in basements listened to the new sound of battle. The Pershing's engine note was lower, heavier, like a hammer striking iron. Survivors who later emerged described it as if monsters of steel had crawled out of the smoke. German soldiers, however, had no time for metaphors. For them it was fear, raw and immediate. Years of propaganda about technological superiority dissolved in front of their eyes. Each destroyed Panther was not just a loss of a tank, it was a blow to the myth of invincibility. Each Pershing that shrugged off a hit was a reminder that the tide of war had turned, not just in numbers but in steel. The shock was not only technical, it was psychological. For so long, the Germans had relied on the idea that their tanks, their weapons were unmatched. A Panther crew watching their comrades burn while an American tank pushed forward unscathed felt something more devastating than defeat. They felt disbelief, and disbelief is poison on the battlefield. It corrodes resolve faster than any bullet. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Post-War Interrogation, 1946. The square became a killing ground. Smoke, fire, and shouts echoed across stone walls that had seen centuries of history, but never this kind of violence. The Pershings moved methodically, like predators with endless patience. Sherman crews, fighting alongside them, looked on in awe, as their new brothers-in-arms carved a path through Cologne's defenses. One young gunner later recalled the feeling of watching a Pershing fire. It was like standing beside a thunderstorm that had taken the shape of a tank. Oral history transcript, 2nd Armored Division veteran. By nightfall, whispers spread among German units. Neue amerikanische Panzer, new American tanks. They spoke the words with unease, with the same tone they once reserved for their own Tigers and Panthers. No longer were Shermans the butt of cruel jokes. No longer were Allied tanks seen as cannon fodder. A new beast had arrived, one built not to be prey, but predator. The defenders of Cologne, who had once believed they could bleed the Americans street by street, now faced an opponent they did not understand. The sudden presence of Pershings felt like a shadow falling across the battlefield, a warning of what was still to come. In cellars and command posts, German officers scrawled frantic notes, struggling to explain what they had seen. Some dismissed it as luck, an accident of angles. Others, with haunted eyes, admitted quietly that something fundamental had shifted. The Pershings rolled forward, their guns lowering toward the next intersection, their treads grinding the cobblestones into dust. Smoke trailed behind them like banners of inevitability. What had been a day of routine resistance had turned into a revelation. The Americans had brought something new, and it was deadly. And as the sun set behind the shattered skyline of Cologne, one chilling realization began to spread through the German ranks. If these new tanks were here, on German soil, then the end was closer than anyone had dared to admit. The war was no longer a matter of if, it was a matter of when. But the question remained, how had the Americans managed this transformation so suddenly? How had the clumsy, undergunned Sherman, long derided as a death trap by both friend and foe, given way to a steel monster capable of facing tigers and winning? The answer lay not only in factories and blueprints, but in desperation, adaptation, and a quiet revolution in American armor. The Pershing had appeared like a ghost in the ruins of Cologne, but its story had begun long before the first 90mm shell fired across the square. To understand how it arrived and why the Germans never saw it coming, we must step back from the smoke and rubble back to the broader war, where strategies clashed, factories roared, and doctrines shaped destinies. The battlefield had revealed the shock. The history would reveal the secret. Spring 1944. The world was already deep into its 5th year of total war, and Europe was burning. The Eastern Front devoured men and machines in numbers beyond comprehension, while the Western Allies prepared for the largest amphibious invasion in history. Yet behind the thunder of artillery and the roar of engines, something subtler brewed, a silent arms race not of numbers, but of steel, design, and doctrine. For the German army, tank warfare had become both its pride and its burden. The sleek Panzer IV, once the jewel of blitzkrieg, now struggled against swarms of Allied Shermans and Soviet T-34. To maintain superiority, the Wehrmacht had fielded the Panther and the Tiger, machines of terrifying reputation. The Panther's 75mm high-velocity gun could cut through most enemy tanks at over a mile, while the Tiger's fearsome 88mm gun turned the battlefield into a killing ground. These tanks were not merely weapons, they were symbols of technological dominance. Bundesarchiv, Panzerwaffe Memorandum, 1944. Across the Atlantic, the Americans saw war differently. Their doctrine did not revolve around singular machines of terror, but around overwhelming numbers and reliability. The M4 Sherman was designed to be mass-produced, easy to repair, and capable of being shipped across oceans in endless convoys. It was not built to duel the Tiger head-on. It was built to be everywhere all at once. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 49,000 Shermans rolled off American assembly lines, a figure the Germans could never dream of matching. U.S. War Department Production Report, 1945. But as the war raged into its later years, a dark truth began to emerge. American crews knew the Sherman was outgunned. In Normandy's hedgerows, in the Ardennes' frozen forests, and across the plains of France, Sherman after Sherman burned under the shells of German Panthers. Entire platoons were wiped out in ambushes, where their 75mm guns could barely scratch German armor frontally. Veterans called their machines Ronsons lighters, because they seemed to ignite after a single hit. The doctrine of mobility and mass was colliding with the brutal realities of German firepower. Oral testimony, 3rd Armored Division, Nara. Meanwhile, the Germans clung to their doctrine of superiority. For them, tank design was an art of perfection. Each Panther was meticulously crafted, each Tiger a towering fortress of steel, but this pursuit of perfection came with a cost. Panthers and Tigers were expensive, slow to produce, and plagued with mechanical issues. At Kursk, hundreds of Panthers broke down before they even reached the front lines. The Wehrmacht was fighting a war of attrition with weapons that could not be replaced fast enough. Wehrmacht Technical Readiness Report, July 1943. American strategists watched with growing unease. Reports from Europe were blunt. Shermans were not only dying in large numbers, they were dying faster than replacements could arrive in some sectors. Commanders pleaded for something more, something that could meet the German heavy tanks head-on. General Omar Bradley himself expressed concern after Normandy. "Our tank crews deserve better." Bradley Papers, Eisenhower Presidential Library. Thus began the debate that would reshape American armored doctrine. On one side were the pragmatists, who insisted that the Sherman's role was not to fight tanks, but to support infantry and exploit breakthroughs. On the other side were the realists, veterans who had seen too many friends die in burning Shermans, who knew that doctrine meant nothing when staring down the barrel of a Tiger's 88. It was not theory they demanded. It was survival. In Washington and Detroit, the call was answered. Hidden behind the walls of the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, engineers had been quietly working on prototypes of something new, something heavier. It was larger, thicker, more powerful than the Sherman. It mounted a 90 gun, a weapon that promised to pierce the armor of even the feared Tiger. This was the T-26 project, later christened the Pershing. Technical Development File, Detroit Arsenal, 1944. But timing was everything. The U.S. Army had invested so deeply in the Sherman that replacing it outright seemed impossible. Training, supply, logistics, all were built around the Sherman's availability. Replacing the fleet in the middle of a global war risked chaos. For months, arguments raged between the Ordnance Department and Army ground forces. Should America stick with numbers and reliability, or gamble on heavier machines that might change the tide of battle? Army Ground Forces Memorandum 1944. The Germans, for their part, had no idea such debates were happening. In their minds, the Americans would continue throwing Shermans into the fire. Reports from Normandy and the Ardennes confirmed their belief that Allied armor was inferior. In the diaries of German panzer crews, Shermans were mocked as easy prey, their destruction tallied like hunting trophies. One Panther commander wrote with cold certainty, "They cannot challenge us directly. They drown us with numbers, not steel." Dramatized composite from Panzer Crew Diaries, 1944. What they did not realize was that the tide of numbers was about to meet a new quality. Slowly, prototypes of the Pershing rolled out for trials. In testing, its armor shrugged off the Sherman's 75 shells. Against mock-ups of German armor, its 90 gun punched through with startling ease. The weapon that American tankers had long prayed for was finally real. The only question was whether it would arrive in time to matter. Technical Manual TM 9374, 1944. The broader war only added urgency. In late 1944, the Battle of the Bulge shattered any illusions of quick victory. American tankers, caught in the snow and forests, once again faced German Panthers in brutal duels. Shermans were slaughtered at ranges where they could not even reply. Yet through the smoke of defeat, High Command saw an opportunity. If the Pershing could be rushed to the front, it could break the stalemate of armor that had bled American divisions white. Thus, in secrecy, preparations began. Trains carried the first Pershings across the United States, their silhouettes covered in tarps. They were loaded onto ships under guarded watch, their presence concealed even from many Allied soldiers. Only select units would be chosen to test them in combat. The gamble was immense. If the Pershing succeeded, it could shock the Germans into realizing their dominance was over. If it failed, it would confirm every fear that America's armor doctrine had been flawed from the start. U.S. Army Ordnance After Action Review, 1945. By the winter of 1945, the stage was set. The Sherman had carried the Allies across half of Europe, but now its replacement lurked just over the horizon. The Pershing was ready, but not yet revealed. German commanders still believed the battlefield was theirs to dominate with Tigers and Panthers. What they did not know was that in the ruins of their own cities they were about to meet a tank they had never imagined. A machine built not just to match them but to beat them. The shock of Cologne was waiting, and with it, the unraveling of an entire doctrine of superiority. Winter 1945. The war in Europe was approaching its climax, though no soldier on either side could truly sense the end. Every day still brought blood, steel, and smoke. For the Germans, their armored divisions remained their pride. Their faith rested in the Tiger and Panther. In guns and armor they believed no Allied tank could match. They were certain that the Americans would continue to bleed out Shermans like water from a broken dam. What they did not realize was that something new, something hidden, was already rolling toward them. The hidden advantage was not merely steel. It was the culmination of frustration, desperation, and ingenuity. For years, American crews had begged for heavier armor and stronger guns. Their cries had been drowned by doctrine and bureaucracy. Yet beneath the surface, the Ordnance Department had quietly nurtured a project born in secret workshops and test grounds, the T-26. This tank, later christened the M26 Pershing, was a machine designed to answer the German challenge. Technical Development File, Detroit Arsenal, 1944. Its advantage lay first in its gun, the M390mm. This weapon was not just a larger cannon. It was a response to battlefield necessity. Reports from Normandy were filled with phrases like Sherman ineffective against Panther front armor. Again and again, crews described shells bouncing harmlessly off German steel. But in the hands of the Pershing, the 90mm gun turned that story around. It could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther at over 800 meters, and even the Tiger I, long feared as invincible, could be killed head-on. For German crews used to laughing at incoming fire, the sudden realization that American tanks could strike back was nothing short of terrifying. Technical Manual TM 9374, 1945. Yet the weapon alone was not the advantage. Equally crucial was armor. The Pershing's hull front was 102 mm thick, sloped to deflect incoming rounds. Its turret face measured up to 114 mm. Against the 75 mm guns of the Panzer IV, the Pershing was practically invulnerable. Against the 88 mm of the Tiger, survival was no longer a matter of luck. For once, American crews could take a hit and live to fire back. That changed everything, not only in combat effectiveness but in morale. Tankers who had lived with the constant knowledge that their Shermans could ignite at any moment now felt something foreign: confidence. U.S. Ordnance Armor Trial Report, 1945. The hidden advantage extended beyond steel and guns. It was also in communication. Each Pershing carried advanced radio sets, linking tank to tank with clarity. For the Germans, coordination had always been their edge. Radio discipline and fast communication allowed their panzers to outmaneuver slower, Allied responses. But now Pershing crews could speak to one another across streets and battlefields, creating a harmony of movement. A single platoon of Pershings could coordinate fire, suppress ambushes, and trap enemy armor with deadly precision. It was as if the Americans had finally stolen the German symphony and learned to play it louder. Signal Corps Communication Notes, 1945. And then there was psychology. Hidden advantages are often as much about perception as performance. For years, German crews had been conditioned to view Shermans as weak. They knew the silhouette. They expected the easy kill. So when the Pershing appeared, looking larger, with its long-barreled 90mm gun and squat, formidable stance, the shock was immediate. Eyewitness accounts describe German tankers pausing, hesitating, unsure whether they were facing a modified Sherman or something entirely new. That hesitation was fatal. In tank combat, seconds decide life or death. Dramatized composite from Cologne Defender Reports, 1945. The Germans were slow to realize what was happening. At first, they dismissed the Pershing as isolated experiments. A single tank here, another there, statistical anomalies. They believed their Panthers still ruled the battlefield. But as the weeks passed, more reports trickled in. Panthers destroyed head-on. Tigers penetrated at ranges they had once considered safe. These fragments painted a grim picture. The Americans had finally leveled the playing field. Bunda Sarkev, Fragmentary Combat Reports, 1945. For American crews, the hidden advantage was liberation. Tankers who had once fought in terror now fought with resolve. One veteran of the 3rd Armored Division later recalled the first time he fired the Pershing's gun in combat. "We hit the Panther straight in the front plate. It went up in flames. For the first time, I felt we were not the hunted. We were the hunters." Oral History, 3rd Armored Division veteran, 1946. This transformation echoed across the front lines. Infantrymen, who had once joked grimly about riding Shermans into slaughter, now spoke with awe about the Pershing. The presence of just a few could stiffen resistance, embolden attacks, and sow doubt in enemy ranks. In ruined cities like Cologne and small villages along the Rhine, the sudden thunder of a 90 gun became a sound both feared and celebrated. But the advantage was not simply material, it was strategic. By deploying Pershings in limited numbers, the Americans created an illusion far greater than reality. German commanders had no idea how many existed. For all they knew, dozens or hundreds were rolling in. This uncertainty gnawed at their planning. How could they prepare ambushes when every corner might hide a new predator? How could they commit their dwindling armor reserves when the battlefield balance had shifted? U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Analysis, 1945. Hidden advantages rarely stay hidden for long. Soon, German intelligence realized what they were facing. A new American heavy tank. Reports filtered up the chain. Warnings of Schwerer Panzer No, a new heavy tank, dangerous and resilient. Yet by the time they fully understood, it was too late. The Pershing was already proving itself, not in theory, but in fire and blood. In Cologne, the hidden advantage revealed itself in devastating clarity. A single Pershing, facing off against a Panther in front of the cathedral, fired one shot that turned an enemy giant into a burning wreck. Civilians filmed the moment with a captured camera, an image that would echo through history, a snapshot of doctrine shattering in real time. Cologne Cathedral battle footage, Signal Corps Archives, 1945. The Germans could not believe what they were seeing, because belief itself had become a weapon. The hidden advantage was not just steel thickness or gun caliber, it was the sudden inversion of expectation. The hunter had become the hunted, and the battlefield had changed forever. As Pershings prowled forward, the Germans asked themselves in fear, how many of these are coming? The truth was fewer than they imagined. But the illusion was enough. For in war, the shadow of a weapon can be as powerful as the weapon itself. And yet, while soldiers on both sides felt the immediate shock, few understood the full scope. Behind the terrifying debut of the Pershing lay years of technical struggle, prototypes, failed designs, and relentless innovation. To see how this hidden advantage was forged, one must peel back the steel plates and study the machine itself, the weapon born not in the battlefield's chaos, but in the cold calculations of engineers and factories. The machine that rolled into Cologne was not conjured from smoke and fire. It was the product of factories, blueprints, and mines that had wrestled with steel and mathematics for years. The Pershing was more than a tank. It was a symbol of America's industrial muscle finally turned toward creating something that could stare down the Panther and Tiger as equals. To understand its true weight, one must dissect its bones, its armor, its heart of steel and oil. The Pershing tipped the scales at over 41 tons, nearly 10 tons heavier than the Sherman it replaced. Its silhouette was lower, wider, more grounded. Where the Sherman had been boxy and upright, the Pershing crouched like a predator ready to spring. At the front, the hull's armor was 102 thick, sloped sharply to deflect incoming rounds. Its turret face reached 114 of hardened steel. In comparison, the Sherman's frontal armor maxed at just 51 a sheet that German shells punched through with ease. Technical Manual TM 374, 1945. The heart of its bite lay in its gun. The M390 This cannon was a monster compared to the Sherman's 75 or even its later 76 upgrade. Firing armor-piercing capped shells, the 90 could penetrate 120 of vertical armor at 1,000 yards. Against a Panther's 80 glacis, the Pershing could kill frontally where Sherman's had bounced harmlessly. Even the dreaded Tiger I, with its 100 frontal plate, was vulnerable within 1,000 yards. German crews accustomed to dictating range now found themselves within reach of an American gun that could kill them before they had time to retreat. U.S. Army Ordnance Firing Trials 1945. The Pershing's mobility, though slower than the Sherman, was far from clumsy. Powered by the Ford GAF V8 engine, it produced 500 horsepower, pushing the tank to a top speed of 25 miles per hour on roads. The Sherman could manage up to 30 miles per hour, but speed was no longer the decisive factor. Survivability and firepower outweighed raw velocity. The Pershing's torsion bar suspension, borrowed from German engineering concepts, gave it a smoother ride across rubble and mud, making it more stable when firing on the move. U.S. Army Technical Evaluation, 1945. A tank, however, is not merely a gun and armor, it is a crew's home, their coffin or their salvation. Inside the Pershing, 5 men worked in tight concert. The commander sat beneath a cupola fitted with periscopes, giving him a commanding view of the battlefield. The gunner and loader shared the cramped turret, muscles tense as they slammed heavy 90 rounds into the breech. The driver and bow gunner nestled in the hull, coaxing the heavy beast through ruins and mud. Unlike the Sherman, whose thin armor gave crews little faith in survival, the Pershing offered them a fighting chance. Ordnance Training Manual, 1945. American innovation lay not only in steel, but in production. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant, operated by Chrysler, had become the beating heart of Allied armored might. This facility, a cathedral of industry, churned out tanks with assembly line precision, where German factories crafted Panthers and Tigers with artisan care and limited numbers. Detroit built with ruthless efficiency. By the time Pershings were ready for combat, America's industrial base could sustain their production without starving the armies of Shermans. It was not just a tank, it was proof that America could adapt even in the final stages of war. Detroit Arsenal Production Report, 1945. Against German designs, the Pershing represented both imitation and evolution. The Panther weighed slightly more at 45 tons, with its long 75 gun capable of piercing most Allied armor. The Tiger of Fur, heavier still at 57 tons, carried the legendary 88 Cobra K-36. On paper, the German giants still appeared formidable, yet their flaws betrayed them. Panthers suffered from mechanical breakdowns, fragile final drives, and engines prone to fire. Tigers were slow, guzzling fuel the Reich could no longer supply. In contrast, the Pershing, while not flawless, balanced firepower, protection and reliability in a way that German tanks could not match in 1945. Wehrmacht Mechanical Failure Records, 1944. What made the Pershing truly dangerous was not its superiority in every metric, but its balance. It could fight and survive. It could hit and withstand hits. German tankers who once dictated the terms of engagement now faced an enemy machine that neutralized their greatest advantage. The American has built a proper panzer, one captured officer admitted in interrogation. It is no longer the same war for us. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Every bolt, every weld told a story of adaptation. Engineers at the Aberdeen Proving Ground had tested early prototypes mercilessly, firing round after round into armor plates, pushing engines to their breaking points. Failures were torn apart, redesigned and rebuilt. The 76 gun, once hoped to be America's answer, was discarded as insufficient. The Pershing emerged only after the hard lessons of Normandy and the Ardennes had proven that compromise was no longer an option. Aberdeen Testing Report, 1944. Even its name carried weight. Named after General John J. Pershing, the commander of American forces in World War I, the tank was meant to embody the spirit of a new American armored force. Modern, aggressive, unyielding. The crews who first received it understood the symbolism. They were not just driving another tank, they were driving the product of every Sherman crew that had burned before them. It was vengeance forged in steel. Yet the Pershing's technical story was also one of restraint. Only about 20 Pershings reached Europe before the war's end. They were latecomers rushed into combat with little time for training or refinement, but their impact was out of proportion to their numbers. Each Pershing was a hammer striking the myth of German superiority, each battle a demonstration that the tide of armored warfare had shifted. The technical advantage was undeniable. The psychological advantage was immeasurable. When German tankers first encountered the Pershing, they faced not just a machine but the embodiment of industrial inevitability. America had taken the lessons of Normandy's burning hedgerows and Ardennes' frozen ambushes and built a weapon designed specifically to end their reign. And yet, technology only matters when tested in fire. For all its promise, the Pershing still had to prove itself in battle, where mud clogged tracks, optics fogged with smoke, and men's nerves broke under the weight of war. Its trial by fire was coming, not in theory, not in factory reports, but in the shattered streets of Germany itself. There the Pershing would write its legend in flame and ruin. February 25, 1945. The city of Elsdorf, west of Cologne, smouldered under the ceaseless pounding of artillery. Streets that once carried market carts and schoolchildren now echoed with the guttural roar of tank engines. The 3rd Armored Division pushed forward cautiously, its Shermans weaving through rubble-strewn lanes. But alongside them rumbled something new. Larger, heavier, its barrel stretching outward like a spear, the M26 Pershing was about to face its first trial by fire. The Germans had not abandoned their defenses quietly. Elements of the 9th Panzer Division lingered in the area, determined to bleed the Americans with ambushes. Concealed in the ruins, a Panther lay in wait. Its crew, veterans hardened by years of combat, peered through the gun sight, confident that another Sherman kill awaited them. They knew the sound of the Sherman's radial engine, the thin profile of its armor, but as the Pershing rolled into view, hesitation crept in. The silhouette was unfamiliar, squat, menacing, its turret crowned with a long, thick gun they did not recognize. Still, the Panther fired first. The 75mm shell streaked across the square and struck the Pershing's glacis plate with a shower of sparks. To the shock of the German crew, the round ricocheted harmlessly. Inside the Pershing, the crew barely flinched. The driver kept advancing, the gunner calmly adjusting his sights. Then came the thunderclap. The Pershing's 90mm roared, the recoil slamming through the steel hull. The shell tore into the Panther's frontal armor, penetrating cleanly. Flames erupted from its engine deck as ammunition cooked off. The beast that had dominated Europe's battlefields for 2 years was left as a burning husk. U.S. Army After-Action Report, Elsdorf, February 1945. Word spread quickly. German defenders, hearing the crack of the Pershing's gun and seeing a Panther destroyed in a frontal duel, whispered in disbelief. Die Amerikaner haben einen neuen Panzer. The Americans have a new tank. Panic rippled through the ranks. For the first time, the battlefield balance had shifted, not in numbers but in direct combat power. Days later, Cologne itself became the stage for one of the most iconic duels of the war. March 6, 1945. The Gothic spires of Cologne Cathedral loomed over a city reduced to skeletal ruins. German forces clung to the rubble, determined to make the Americans pay for every block. In the heart of the city, a Panther crouched near the cathedral square, its long gun commanding a killing field. Shermans advancing through the streets had already fallen prey to such ambushes, but this time a Pershing led the charge. As the Pershing rolled forward, its crew spotted the Panther across the square. Both tanks froze for a heartbeat, predator and prey unsure who was who. The Panther fired first. Its round screamed across the plaza, slamming into the Pershing's mantlet. The armor held. Smoke and dust cloaked the scene. Through it, the Pershing's gunner steadied his aim. The 90mm barked once, and the Panther shuddered violently. A second shot followed, then a third. The German tank erupted in flames, its crew scrambling desperately as the cathedral's shadow swallowed the wreck. Signal Corps footage, Cologne 1945. This moment was captured on film, one of the rare armored duels immortalized in moving images. For the American soldiers who watched, it was vindication. For German defenders, it was revelation. The tank they had mocked as inferior had been replaced by something that could meet them head-on and win. Yet battles were not fought by tanks alone. In Cologne, Pershings and Shermans advanced together, infantry clinging to their sides, weaving through streets alive with snipers and Panzerfausts. The Pershings absorbed hits that would have killed Shermans, anchoring the assault. Their 90 guns smashed strongpoints with terrifying efficiency, blasting through walls and bunkers. The psychological effect on both friend and foe was profound. American infantry, long haunted by the spectre of German armor, now advanced with renewed confidence. German defenders, hearing the boom of a 90 felt dread instead of dominance. But the Pershings' baptism of fire was not without cost. In Niel, near Cologne, another Pershing engaged a Tiger I. The duel was brutal, each tank trading thunderous blows. The Tiger's 88 struck first, punching through the Pershing's side armor. Flames engulfed the tank, killing crew members instantly. The loss was a sobering reminder. No tank was invincible. Yet even in death, the Pershing's presence carried weight. The Tiger, once considered the pinnacle of armored warfare, had been forced into a desperate slugging match. The myth of German superiority had cracked, even as the battlefield claimed more lives. Bundesarchiv, Cologne Defense Records, 1945. By late March, the Pershings had carved their legend. At Remagen, where the Ludendorff Bridge offered the Allies a gateway across the Rhine, Pershings rumbled across the span under fire. German artillery and aircraft tried in vain to destroy the crossing, but the sight of Pershings advancing into the heart of Germany broke what little hope remained for defenders. Engineers recorded the bridge trembling under their weight, yet holding long enough for divisions to pour through. Army Corps of Engineers report, Remagen 1945. Every battle added to the aura. In villages and towns when Pershings appeared, German resistance faltered faster. Tank crews, already scarce after years of attrition, hesitated to engage. Infantry, once emboldened by the presence of a Panther, now retreated at the sight of the new American machines. Even when few Pershings were present, their reputation spread like wildfire. Rumors exaggerated their numbers, feeding a myth larger than reality. In truth, fewer than 20 saw action before the war's end, but perception often outweighs fact on the battlefield. Inside their steel coffins, Pershing crews learned quickly that survival no longer felt like a gamble. One commander described the shift. In a Sherman, you prayed the first round missed. In a Pershing, you prayed for the chance to fire first, because you knew it would be enough. Oral testimony, 3rd Armored Division, 1946. The duels of Elsdorf and Cologne were more than isolated clashes. They were proof that America could build a tank equal to Germany's best. Proof that the tide of technology had turned. Proof that the hunters of yesterday could become the hunted of today. The Pershing was not just another machine. It was a symbol that the end was near, that the Reich's armored dominance was collapsing along with its cities. And as the Pershings rolled deeper into Germany, leaving behind burning Panthers and shattered Tigers, their impact stretched far beyond the smoke. They were reshaping not only battles, but the very psychology of war. German soldiers who once fought with swagger now carried doubt. American crews who once feared every duel now carried confidence. The battlefield had changed, and with it, the hearts of the men who fought upon it. But the story of the Pershing was not only about victories in the field. Its greatest power lay in the shadow it cast, the psychological weight of a weapon that redefined the balance of fear and faith. To grasp that, one must look not at the duels themselves, but at what they meant to soldiers, to nations, to the very spirit of war in its final desperate year. The war was not just fought with steel and explosives. It was fought in the hearts and minds of the men who climbed into tanks each morning, never certain if they would live to see nightfall. The Pershing's arrival reshaped those hearts. To American crews it was a revelation. To German crews it was a nightmare. And in that psychological battleground, the hidden advantage proved more powerful than armor thickness or muzzle velocity. For years, American tankers had lived under a shadow. The Sherman was a machine they respected, even loved, for its reliability, but few pretended it was their salvation. They had watched friends burn inside thin-skinned hulls, seen panthers shred platoons before they could even fire back. Veterans described the dread of hearing a tiger's 88mm gunfire, knowing survival was little more than chance. But when Pershings joined their columns, that dread began to fade. Soldiers spoke of standing taller, of advancing with less hesitation. It felt like the first time the deck wasn't stacked against us. One tanker recalled. Oral testimony. 3rd Armored Division veteran, 1946. The change was immediate. Infantrymen marching beside Pershings felt safer, more confident, more willing to push into the ruins of German towns. A 90mm shell crashing through enemy strongpoints was more than firepower. It was reassurance. For men who had lived through the nightmare of the Ardennes, it was vindication. They whispered that at last the Americans had their answer to the Tiger. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. For the Germans the shift was equally profound, but in the opposite direction. The Panther and Tiger had been their pride, their symbols of technological superiority. Propaganda extolled their invincibility, and crews believed it. Each kill was a reinforcement of that myth. But the first time a Panther crew watched their frontal armor fail under an American gun, doubt seeped in. We were told nothing could pierce us, one captured tanker admitted, but the American shot went through like paper. Post-war interrogation, Bundesarchiv, 1945. Doubt is a corrosive force. It spreads quickly, whispering in the dark corners of the mind. If one Panther could be destroyed, then all could be destroyed. If the Americans had one new tank, perhaps they had many. Rumors swept through German lines, exaggerating Pershing numbers, inflating them into battalions where only platoons existed. Fear magnifies shadows, and soon every duel carried hesitation. Seconds lost in uncertainty were seconds Pershings used to kill. Commanders noticed it too. Reports described crews abandoning tanks more quickly, withdrawing from duels they once would have pressed. The Panther, still a formidable predator, was now hunted prey. That reversal mattered far more than statistics. For a war built on confidence in steel, the shattering of that confidence was a death sentence. On the Allied side, the psychological impact reached higher than the battlefield. American commanders, long criticized for sending tankers into unequal fights, finally had a weapon they could hold up with pride. The Pershing was proof that American industry could do more than overwhelm. It could innovate, rival, and surpass. For families back home, stories of Pershings destroying Panthers offered relief, a sense that their sons had more than just luck to shield them. In strategic terms, the timing was devastating for Germany. By 1945, their armored reserves were dwindling. Fuel shortages crippled movement. Factories lay in ruins under Allied bombs. Every tank lost was irreplaceable. When those losses came at the hands of a new American machine, morale fractured further. One German officer noted in despair, "It is not only that we lose tanks, it is that we lose faith. Faith that our weapons can hold them back." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Psychological Warfare Division, 1946. The Pershing's advantage was also symbolic. Its name invoked General John J. Pershing, leader of American forces in the First World War. For German soldiers, that name carried historical weight, a reminder that America, twice removed from Europe, had returned with greater force. To face a tank bearing that name in their own cities felt like history itself had turned against them. Even when Pershings were destroyed, their legend grew. The duel in Niehl, where a Tiger killed a Pershing, was rare enough to be noted with pride by German crews, but victories like that no longer carried the same certainty. The Tiger had not annihilated a Sherman with ease. It had traded blows with an equal. In that trade, the myth of invincibility cracked beyond repair. For American soldiers, each Pershing kill was a psychological salve. One gunner described watching his 90mm round pierce a Panther. The flames went up, and it felt like justice. Like every Sherman we'd lost had been avenged in that moment. Oral testimony, 3rd Armored Division, 1946. That feeling of justice, multiplied across units, fueled momentum. War is as much about momentum as it is about maps. and the Pershing gave the Allies both. The effect extended to civilians too. German citizens, peering from basements, described the sight of Pershings rolling through their streets. They were different from Shermans, not only in size but in presence. They looked unstoppable, their barrels like spears aimed at the heart of the Reich. For civilians already weary, it was a visible symbol that the war was lost. For the Allies, it was a promise that the end was near. Psychological warfare is often subtle, but in 1945 it was painted in fire across Germany's cities. Each duel, each destroyed panzer, was a message. To German crews, your time is over. To American crews, your time has come. To civilians, the steel tide is unstoppable. And yet, behind the glory and fear, a sobering truth remained. The Pershing had arrived late, too late to save the thousands of Sherman crews who had died in earlier campaigns, too late to change the outcome of the war which was already turning against Germany, but not too late to change its ending. By striking at the myth of German superiority, the Pershing accelerated the collapse, not by numbers but by eroding the will to fight. The battlefield is made of iron and earth, but victory is forged in the human mind. In 1945, the Pershing proved that sometimes the heaviest weapon is belief itself. But war does not end with the silence of guns. Its lessons echo into the future, shaping doctrine, technology, and the wars yet to come. The Pershing's legacy did not end in Cologne's Cathedral Square. It carried forward into the Cold War, Korea, and beyond. To understand its true place in history, one must trace the shadow it cast long after the last panther burned. The ruins of Cologne smoldered, the Rhine bridges trembled under Allied armor, and the Reich was collapsing into chaos. Yet even as the Pershings rumbled deeper into Germany, their story was only beginning. For while they fought only a handful of battles in the final months of World War II, their presence carried far beyond 1945. They were not just tanks, they were harbingers of a new age of warfare, and their legacy shaped armies long after the smoke of Europe had cleared. In the short term, the Pershing symbolized a painful lesson. The United States had entered the war with the Sherman, a tank built for speed, logistics, and quantity. That doctrine carried them through North Africa, Italy, Normandy, and the Ardennes, but at a terrible cost. Tens of thousands of Sherman crews paid with their lives, facing Tigers and Panthers with courage but inadequate firepower. The Pershing arrived too late to change that grim ledger, but it proved that America could have matched Germany's armor sooner had the will been there. Ordnance Department Postwar Review, 1946. Yet the tank was not simply a correction. It was a bridge. The Pershing stood halfway between the old world of Sherman mobility and the new world of Cold War heavy armor. Its 90 mm gun and thick armor made it one of the first American tanks built explicitly for tank versus tank duels. That philosophy carried forward into the M46, M47, and eventually the M48 Patton series. Each iteration refined the Pershing's balance of firepower, armor, and mobility, cementing the idea that American tanks must never again go to war undergunned. Technical Development History, Aberdeen Proving Ground, 1947. The impact was not limited to America. The Germans, once so proud of their Tigers and Panthers, watched with bitter clarity as their designs became the templates of the future. Sloped armor, torsion bar suspension, long-barreled high-velocity guns, all concepts perfected in German workshops, were now standard features in Allied tanks. The Pershing was proof that the Allies had not only copied but improved upon those ideas. For captured German engineers, the sight of Pershings prowling their cities was a cruel irony, their own innovations wielded against them. Bundesarchiv Technical Memoirs, 1946. The Pershing's legacy was sealed in Korea. 5 years after the flames of Cologne, the M26 and its descendants fought against Soviet-built T-34-85Es across the Korean peninsula. There, the Pershing's 90 mm again proved decisive, destroying T-34Es in brutal duels that echoed the battles of 1945. Crews who had once feared Panthers now taught a new generation of tankers the lessons of confidence and firepower. The M26 may have been a latecomer in Europe, but in Korea it was the right tank at the right time, proving itself against the weapon that had defined the Eastern Front. U.S. Army Operational Report, Korea, 1951. Strategically, the Pershing taught militaries a universal truth: quantity wins wars, but quality decides moments. The Sherman's mass production overwhelmed Germany, but the Pershing's presence shattered morale in ways numbers never could. That duality carried forward into Cold War doctrine. NATO planners, staring across the Iron Curtain at Soviet armor divisions, knew they could not rely on numbers alone. The memory of Sherman's burning against Tigers and Pershing's triumphing against Panthers haunted every discussion of tank design for decades. NATO Armored Doctrine Review, 1953. Psychologically, the Pershing left an even deeper scar. German veterans remembered it not as the most common enemy they faced, but as the one that broke their certainty. When the Pershing came, we knew it was over, one Panzer officer admitted years later, not because it destroyed us in numbers, but because it destroyed the belief that we were better. Dramatized composite, post-war interviews, 1950s. For American veterans, the Pershing became a symbol of vindication. Crews who had survived Sherman's service spoke with pride of the few months they commanded a machine that made them hunters rather than prey. It was, to them, the tank that should have come sooner, but still came in time to matter. The Pershing also shaped a lesson for future generals. Never underestimate the value of morale in machinery. A tank is steel and gears, but it is also a promise to its crew. The Sherman promised reliability but little protection. The Pershing promised survival and victory. That promise gave men courage, and courage wins battles as surely as armor plates deflect shells. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Psychological Analysis, 1946. Its legacy also lies in the footage, the rare film of a Pershing destroying a Panther in Cologne. That grainy black and white sequence has been replayed in countless documentaries, classrooms and war games. It is one of the only recorded tank duels of the Second World War, a fragment of history frozen in time. In that short clip, the myths of German superiority collapsed before the lens of a camera, and the Pershing's legend was born. And so the story ends not just with victory, but with a universal lesson. War is a contest of industry, of doctrine, of courage, but above all, it is a contest of adaptation. Those who fail to adapt pay in blood. Those who adapt, even late, can change the tide of history. The Pershing was America's adaptation, born too late to save thousands, but not too late to help end the war, and to light the path for the future. In modern war, the lesson echoes still, from Abrams tanks in the deserts of the Gulf War to Leopards and T-90C. In today's conflicts, the balance of firepower, protection and mobility remains the core of armored doctrine. The shadow of the Pershing lingers, whispering across decades: never again go to battle with less than your enemy. Never again let your soldiers fight with weapons unworthy of their courage. And so the final image remains, a Pershing advancing through Cologne's ruins, its barrel smoking, its tracks grinding stone into dust. Behind it, a Panther burns in silence. Above it, the cathedral towers into a grey sky, and in that image lies the end of an old war, the beginning of a new age, and a timeless truth carved into history. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, speed defeats armor, and belief in steel, in survival, in victory, is the most powerful weapon of all.